All right, so good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this INDUS-X panel series. We are on session number 3, and I think we have a really great panel for you today. The plan is to go about an hour, so we will see where we're at in about 40 minutes. And I just want to remind the participants that if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and I'll monitor those and we'll get to those a little later on. But first, I just want to introduce myself. I guess I should also say, I think I said good morning, but good evening. It's probably better to say good day to everybody. Introduce myself. My name is Alyssa Robertson. I am based with the Navy out of Naval Surface Warfare Center, Crane, Indiana, where I am our command's liaison to Ensign and DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. Within Ensign, I am now the acting Midwest Regional Director. So you can always feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you have in the Midwest. And we have a team of folks that I can direct you to for some specifics if you ever need that. And then I just wanted to quickly mention some of my background. I worked for the Navy in supply chain for about 7 years, focusing on supply chain risk management and counterfeit avoidance. And I'm hoping that that pairs nicely with our panelists today. So I want to get to that and get you introduced to our panelists. First, I'd like to quickly start with their names and titles before I hand it off to them and give them a little bit of time to introduce themselves and how they got into this space. So our first panelist is Dr. Nick Vyas, and he is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Center for Global Supply Chain Management at University of Southern California. Our second panelist joining us is Mr. Vikas Keitha. He is the Vice President and Head of Corporate Offices of Larson and Toubro Defense. So just to give you a quick little softball lob, soft pitch question to get us rolling into this panel, I just would ask that you can introduce yourself maybe a little more broadly and maybe explain to the participants what brought you into this space and what brought you into supporting the integrity of the supply chain for defense specifically. And I think I will start with Vikas, please.
Well, good morning and to folks in the US and good evening to panelists and attendees in India. So I am Vikas Keitha. I work with Larson Toubro, or L&T as we are more commonly known. Brief background about L&T: we are publicly listed, diversified conglomerate. We're headquartered in India at Mumbai. We operate in 60 countries around the world. In India, we are known for defense, space, and shipbuilding. But we are even better known for our construction and power projects. The company is 85 years old, and it was founded by 2 Danish engineers during the World War. What brought L&T into this would be more pertinent rather than what brought me into this space. So L&T has been in the defense sector for the last 50 years, and also in the space sector for an equal length of time. So we've been associated with Indian space programs from the first launch onwards. We operate across the land, naval, and aerospace domain, and are now getting into high-tech areas also. I have run through most of the businesses of L&T and most geographies of L&T. What brought me here was frankly the conflict which started in Europe a couple of years ago. So I just received a call from our chairman and I was told, move to defense tomorrow. That was it. There is some past background to this. Long ago, at at the initial stage of my career, I have been associated with developing supply chains for the auto sector. Briefly in between, also for the defense and aerospace sector, both in India and in Europe. And I suppose that is why I was brought back here to this sector. Over to you, Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nick, would you like to add in as well?
Well, good evening, everyone, attendees in India, and good morning, Alyssa. So my background, I'm the founding executive director for Institute at University of Southern California, known as the Kendrick Global Supply Chain Management Institute. My journey into the academia about 13 years ago, where I started both the Masters of Science in Global Supply Chain Management and the Center of Excellence at the same time. My background academically is industrials and systems engineer, and initial journey from the consulting, I just took a detour into supply chain and never looked back. So from the commercial supply chain end to end, from sourcing all the way to last mile delivery, and any imaginable vertical, I've had chance to work on it. But more specifically, I think my last decade or so working with the government, both with the Department of Commerce, supply chain competitive committees, and the countries across the world in advising governments on the governance of what the supply chain resiliency, agility, and sort of a sustainability space should look like. So the only thing I can tell you, 2014, I was the first one to actually talk about the decouplings of supply chain way before the pandemic. And obviously I did not have the foresight of the COVID, but we kind of studied and analyzed that the network globally were very fragile, and it was a matter of time before it'll disrupt. And obviously we found out COVID really exposed some of the structural deficiencies.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as you most likely know, now that this is our third session, and you probably all have some awareness of Defense Innovation Unit and National Security Innovation Network, the mission here is really to bring in startups and also talent through workforce development efforts. And so I would like to start off with better understanding, since one of you is very heavily involved in the startup and tech sector and working as a prime, working with some of those small business, and the other is more focused on academia. How can we better educate some of those startups in India and allow them to partner with primes? So what is an entryway into working with you in India? And Vikas, we'll start with you, and then we'll shift that to the academic realm for USC and Nick.
Okay, so let me try and respond to this question by first taking a step back and giving you a background. So over the past 3 decades, there was 3 decades ago, there was a thrust on manufacturing that was led by the auto industry, and then for a period in between, we found manufacturing industry was being overshadowed by services, and also we were midway somewhere, and then suddenly got cut off and sort of lost our way. However, over the last 10 years, there's been a renewed thrust on manufacturing, and particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, there's also been a thrust on the startup ecosystem. India also had other issues of being able to finance and fund startups. So there's been amendment to policies. The government of the day is extremely liberal. It has provided credit guarantee schemes to small industry and to startups. The defense primes in India have, at least the few that I'm aware of, have a system of incubating startups. We also try to startup primarily need two things. One is finance, which the government has sort of brought about by various policies and schemes, and the other thing is orders and continuity of orders. So that's something that the defense primes do, and also the government. So there are IDEX challenges which are being done. So in the space segment, in the space sector in India, my personal observation is the startups have done extremely well and they're flourishing. Defense being a much wider area, so there are pockets where we still have to, especially in the high-tech areas, where we still have some distance to cover. But on the conventional, in the conventional industry, the startups have been doing quite well. And on our part, we are encouraged to support the startups and take the journey forward. So for now, I think I'll pause here.
Okay, so Nick, we'll obviously talk about USC and their association with the Microelectronics Commons Hub a little later, but are there any other ways that they can get connected to you and work with academia more specifically on your side?
No, absolutely, Lisa. So in January, I mean, I spent almost an entire month in India, and we hosted the USC India Symposium, which was attended by Ambassador Garcetti, who delivered the keynote. And if you just listen to the synopsis of the keynote and the subsequent symposium that I led, there's a tremendous optimism about India and the role of India. And overall, I'm talking about not just specific to in defense and space, but I mean, you look at it, the growth opportunities, right? So let's talk specifically about the defense industry. 2024, it's approximately $2.3 trillion will be spent on the defense, highest ever prorated since the World War II. So there is a huge market expansion on the spend, right? Our European partners are contributing a lot more to the defense budget. Obviously, India is expanding its reach, and US, we continue to build that sector. So if I am a startup entrepreneur, I mean, I look at it, the ecosystem as a whole, and I see a tremendous growth. Now, within those areas, if you look at it as a startup, where is the friction? Where is an opportunity to truly leverage some of the advanced technology and some of the strategic initiatives that you can play into it? And I think my observation in January, India has a robust startup ecosystem now. I had the privilege to meet one of the Shark Tank India Shark, and Suez mentioned this. There is about 140 plus small venture capital firms now that they're on the ground looking for ideas, and obviously on all sectors, but the defense and space obviously is a huge opportunity. So the way Institute works, obviously we have a deep tie with India. USC is very committed to even expand our outreach and building the cooperation there. So anyone who really needs help to the Institute in terms of setting up the business ideation and all the way to the maturity, I'll be more than happy to support from here on this end.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to move on to talk about what are some of the more forward-looking initiatives happening between the US and India. And I think I'm going to start with Nick on this one. We've in some of our preparations, we talked about the gift city. So maybe you both have some ideas on that ecosystem and what that potentially provides. But I would definitely be interested to hear what are each of your very forward-looking initiatives, whether they're new or they are very established. I think people are probably looking for any opportunity to get involved.
Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting topic, right, Alyssa? If you think about, I had an opportunity to visit, and I was on the panel for Vibrant Gujarat, which was in January, uh, middle of the January, and I was pretty impressed what that concept about being able to provide the very dynamic and robust ecosystem for businesses to come in and bring the foreign direct investment and be able to repatriate in any denomination that one can, and having some sort of a liberal business policy and guarantee on the freedom of transactions, I think provides an incredible leg up for India. So the GIFT City is truly a very innovative ways of India to position itself and create what traditionally has been very business-friendly hubs, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, and Switzerland in a fintech space. So I think that's a great way to look at it, the progression that India has taken. But to answer your question as overall about the US and India, I think Ambassador Garcetti articulated very well that India is not looked at it from the US standpoint. We're not looking at this as a China plus strategy. So India is not in the play for US as a China plus. Rather, it is a very strategic partnership that US has looked at. And having served under 3 different administrations, I think that sentiment resonates beyond the party affiliation. So both presidential powers, Democrat and Republican alike, I think the view of strategic partnership with India crosses the political lines. So I think that is certainly a great sort of a foundation that Indian businesses can look at it. And so there's a long-term stability with the relationship with the US that will transact beyond our upcoming election, for example, in November.
And because you mentioned earlier the IDEX challenges, and so for anyone who hasn't seen those that's on the call today, you can be sure to look at diu.mil. That is just one way that India and the US are partnering to better form a relationship, and challenges are something that I'm sure many of you would be very interested in. So that was a great tee up there and a good topic to bring up. But for you, are there any other forward-looking initiatives that you're involved in? Again, whether it's something new that's on the horizon or it's something that's very established that you feel would be pertinent to the conversation.
Yeah, so I've been asked to participate in the strategic vision documents that the government is building called the Vision 2047, which would be the 100-year celebration of independence of India. And I am privileged to provide some insight in terms of the strategic documents, how India can position itself. So there are a couple of areas that I think that stands out. I think, and you touched on it, Alyssa, in the beginning, is human capital. I mean, for India to become a very large advanced economy, it will have to have a human capital structure. And there's a huge gap between what its needs will be and what it currently capacity is. So that's a one big area that we look at. It second, obviously, is the whole entrepreneurial ecosystems that's going to have to come along, which has really started to take a strong roots in last decade or so. And I think that's going to continue. And obviously, you see the market resiliency and optimism about India. It surpasses the third highest now, the market valuation, the stock market valuation. And that is an indication that there's a lot of optimism about India. There's a lot of optimism about Wall Street and the Main Street believing in some of the macro changes that are occurring in India. So I think overall, there are a lot of positive sentiment, and a lot of the counterparts here in India, US rather, the business leaders, they're looking to partake and participate in this space economy being one, defense collaboration, but in technology space, a lot of the startups actually cross-collaborating between the US and India. So overall, I think there's a lot of opportunities for US-India partnership to continue to flourish in the next decade or so.
Great. And Dr. Keith or Mr. Keithan, do you have anything additional that you would add for yourself?
Okay, for a start, you could just call me Vikas. It'll be easier. All right. So see, in terms of what India and the startup ecosystem going forward, and the defense and security landscape, there's a lot that is happening, and there's a background to it, and some of it has been from recent times. We've had, against all forecasts, we have now a situation of prolonged conflict. We have situations of economies, stable economies now beginning to fail. We have, when you look at the, let's say, the commercial, I wouldn't like to reveal defense information on an open call. So let's say if you look at the commercial aerospace segment at the moment, so the US itself has a order backlog of which will take 13 years to fulfill. This is post-COVID pandemic. So the disruptions, the supply chain. So there have been supply chain disruptions across the globe. You also have situations where warfare itself has morphed into a mosaic kind of warfare. So you have extremely sophisticated defense mechanisms being overwhelmed by relatively low tech, missiles, and so there are all kinds of things happening. So to us, in the defense and security space, a few things are quite clear. So the cost of acquisition of a platform or a product or an aggregator or system needs to come down significantly, and it needs to be low cost to operate, to maintain, and so on and so forth. The other thing is, when you look at the commercial aerospace segment in the US, there's shortages of obviously semiconductors, but also of castings and forgings, and which are the conventional. They're in the realm of the conventional industry. And when you also change supply lines, then there are obviously teething issues on quality. So on the one, and then there's an increasing talent shortage. I don't know how you finding it in the US, but in India we are now beginning to feel the pinch that our talent, which is extremely vast, we find that we now have to prioritize tasks. So there are all these dimensions, but overall, given India's demographics, given its, as Dr. Vyas pointed out, a very robust startup ecosystem, I would still say India would be a good bet to partner with with the US, for instance, and bring about some measure of stability, economic and geopolitical, which both seem to be at risk at the moment, right? And there's also the Indo-Pacific. The other day I was looking at the number of ships in the Indo-Pacific, and I realized that even during the World War, we didn't have that many. So, and obviously some of them come from one particular part of the globe, and the others are there too. So there are aspects of ISR which need to come in, and there have been deals. There's been one deal between the US and India on that front. There are more things that are in the offing in discussion. There's a reciprocal defense procurement agreement. There's a SOSA, the Services and Supply Agreement, which has been signed. Now, all this augurs well for industry, and not just for the prime, but also for the tiered industry, both in the US and in India. Talent shortage, frankly, do not have a solution at the moment, but I would defer to the academicians for a way out of that. But clearly, I think there needs to be some a better connect between the industry and US industry, US university. So that clearly would help. So on the whole, extremely positive, very bullish. We just need to. There are a couple of areas where we need to, put in a little more focus. And clearly, semiconductors and electronics are one area. That's a US need as well. It's an Indian need as well. Anyone in India who bought a car, let's say last year, changed their car last year, would have personal experience because you got a car but not the key. So that's where things work. So efforts are on to try and correct this and provide risk mitigation to wherever you have single supplier situation. And I think more of that needs to happen. But on the other hand, I think what also needs to be done is organizations, and especially large global conglomerates, need to use techniques like data analytics and AI to be able to predict these kind of situations. So which means there has to be transparency down the line in the entire tiered supply chain. So you need to be able to identify weak links and work on that in advance and not wait for a problem to throw up those issues. Yeah, so that's
You've teed up the next question very, very well. Both of you have mentioned different critical issues, whether it be pandemics, natural disasters, the geopolitical climate that is definitely looming and ongoing in some areas of the world. And so you brought up some of the supply chain issues surrounding semiconductors and others. I'll just stick with you, Vikas, on this first. But what are some of the vulnerabilities you see, or any additional ones that you didn't just bring up, and how do you see that we circumvent those specifically?
So, okay, so some I've already mentioned, so at the risk of repetition, and so wherever a clear vulnerability is wherever there is a single supplier situation. And that, in industry, that's the first thing we're taught. Never get into such kind of arrangement. So that there are large parts of industrial sectors where we have that situation currently. And semiconductors is clearly one. The US itself, if my memory serves me right, in the early 90s, the US had about upwards of 35% of the global semiconductor market, which I believe now is somewhere in the range of 11-12%. India never had a semiconductor manufacturing system. And our import of electronics actually exceeds our oil import bill. So, it's all, so when you actually sit down and then when you're dealing with sophisticated platforms, and now this is now the age of cybersecurity and quantum computing and electronic warfare, I think you have a vital component missing. So that's a very, very clear vulnerability. And that needs to be, all efforts need to be done to overcome those areas. The other big thing that I can, mention offhand is cybersecurity is an area where a lot needs to be done because technology disruptions will happen, will continue to happen. Quantum computing is just one as of now. Then we have this also appears to be the era of hypersonics. So there is, no detection mechanism, so early warning systems, etc. And so I put all of this in the umbrella of ISR. So space-based systems are, and then after all, how much of manpower can you deploy? So you definitely need to have a combination of manned and unmanned systems, and that goes across terrestrial, aerospace, marine, submarine, those dimensions. of the Earth's surface area. I mean, I can't reach to a naval officer, but that's what the situation is. And so, how much of the oceans have been mapped? I mean, the ocean floor. So, so there are all these dimensions. Now, all this is work to be done. So one can either dwell in the past and lament that it has not been done, or one can roll up the sleeves and say, okay, let's get to work and get this off the ground. So these are, to me, some of the top of the mind vulnerabilities. And of course, you mentioned climate change. People seem to have forgotten that amidst all the conflicts and all. So that is a very, very clear vulnerability, and it's a big one. So all action, including clean energy and all focus in that direction, would only be, we're just trying to catch up with the situation. So these are two broad areas. There are more, but I'll stop here. So,
And Nick, you may be very familiar with the US and our reliance on other countries oftentimes, and that's definitely a vulnerability. But from your point of view, what do you see as some of the vulnerabilities that we are experiencing, and how would you circumvent those as well?
Well, I think one has to first come to the full grasp of where we are. Right? The global trade wind has actually changed the direction. So when the 4 decades of peaceful and prosperous global trade that has brought about where we are today is completely being challenged. And so how has it been challenged? So let's look at the geopolitical. In a microcosm of this geopolitical conflict, we can look at it, Russia, Ukraine. We feel it because we are directly involved in terms of supporting Ukraine here. So back home, this perspective is very clear. I was in Europe for 3 weeks, touched over 6 or 7 countries. They feel it because they're the direct recipient of a geopolitical conflict. So if you just look at this conflict in a very small global trade in 2 commodities, energy and fertilizer, and you realize how disruptive this can be, and we don't know how that war is going to play out yet. On that, we have a huge flashpoint in Middle East. We don't know how that's going to play out. In Indo-Pacific, what Vikas was talking about, we have this whole conflict of how the global trade will be facilitated through the Indo-Pacific, and there are regional conflicts. Not to mention, there's a potential trigger point that I really worry about, and I've modeled this. If you time this out to say 0 to 12 months, 12 to 36 months and beyond, one can look at it, China's move on to the Taiwan, and what would that do? So then you put those microcosms of all of this geopolitical hot spots, and you model these things and say, okay, what does that do to our global trade and a peace and a prosperity? So when I talk about agile, resilient, and sustainable supply chain, it actually bifurcates all of those. Because no rational theory will justify if we were to start the World War III. And what may have seemed for this generation, for us to sort of have a reminiscence of the World War II, that we are on the cusp of having this conflict that can brew up and create a flashpoint that could trigger a wider conflict. So one has to have that geopolitical tension, and this actually really challenges the government, especially the democracies, that they have a similar value systems to start to forge the alliances and say, how do we work together? How do we protect the value system-based trade going forward? Obviously, India being the populous democracy and complex democracy, and us being oldest democracy, I think there is a synergistical value systems alignment that actually has a lot more potential to work together and bridge together. So that's a big issue and fabric that needs to be weaved through the conversation of global trade. Beyond that, if we think about it, I think the second big influence and confluence in the global trade that I see in every sector imaginable, from defense to the space, is some of the technology frontiers that we're exploring right now, right? I mean, I've written books about the blockchain in supply chain and emerging technologies. I mean, AI, in our first inning of the AI in our lives, we have seen the implication of regenerative AI. There are some deep applications that we're now prototyping within the supply chain space. So how would that look? Exciting thing, because it can really help revolutionize some of the things we have done, some of the friction in supply chain that exists, albeit prime to the tier 1, 2, 3, 4 suppliers and relationships with them, and quality controls, inventory management. I can name all the cases that can be applied through this, but let's not forget, it also will create some bad actors to use the same technology. They'll have the humanity. Somebody will find ways to actually create the nemesis out of that. And how would that play out? So I think there is a huge issues of the promising of the technology and downside through the cybersecurity threats. And you look at the wars being fought in Russia today, the drones are playing a major role. What are the next generation warfares and technology that's going to penetrate? And I think there is a lot more digital threat than the physical threat that is actually being calculated at this point in this. So that's a second area. Obviously, every time I talk about all of these problems, one can translate that into the opportunities, because each of this problem and the friction I'm identifying creates a startup opportunity, creates solving the problems, and building the systems to prevent those things from happening. So one has to look at these things as an opportunity as well. But last but not the least, I think my biggest concern is the raw material, essential earth minerals, and what it will take. You can design a manufacturing hub for semiconductor, but if you lack the raw material, I think you're in disadvantage. And today, over 70% of the raw materials is controlled by one country, which happens to dominate this narratives and conversation. So there's a lot of strategic alliances, Quad, US, Australia, Japan, India being one. But these are the forms of sort of a cooperative models of coalitions that are forming up to not only manage the cyber security threats or the intelligence sharings, but the global trade to run on those platforms. And what appears to me, to summarize it, that we're building the parallel universe of global trade. So that will be one track would be that you would have this democratic countries that have a business rules and they're willing to play by those and align with those. And then there's another group, most likely that group will be led by China and its allies and in running. And how does these two parallel tracks of economy that intersect, but also operates independently and creates both the digital infrastructure and financial infrastructure and still be peaceful, is truly a phenomenal space to study and observe over the next decade or so.
Great. I want to give Vikas the opportunity to expand on this in just a moment. And then I have one other question, and I want to remind everyone, we just had a question pop up. So if you have specific questions you want to put in the chat, I'll be getting to those very shortly. But you have both. Well, so first of all, we've talked about what are ways that these startups can get involved and work with you. So there's the entry point that they're now educated on. And now Nick has opened up talking about what are some of the technological forces that he sees as he's been talking about this global supply chain and being able to address some of those vulnerabilities. So because I wanted to give you the opportunity, you both mentioned cybersecurity and AI thus far, blockchain came up. Maybe from your perspective, what are some of the technological forces that you think should be expanded upon and that some of these startups can start to focus in on that what you feel would make a difference to affect the global supply chain?
So in the tech sector, clearly, as I earlier mentioned, cybersecurity, there's a lot more that needs to be done. We thought we had a reasonably secure network here in India. We only discovered that when one of our key hospitals was brought down. It was down for a week or a week plus. So you can imagine, and that's a very popular hospital here in New Delhi. You can imagine the havoc it caused. Now this is one. So you have entire power grids which are at risk, right? And so on and so forth. And you have the air traffic control and the maritime control and everything. So that's, and the financial sector. So the cyber security is one area where a lot of strengthening is needed. And that's an area I would clearly point to a startup which is interested in this space, in that area. Following close on that are also the challenges, the opportunities and the challenges posed by quantum computing. So, so there's quantum communication and so there are various dimensions to it. So although we still see quantum as something to worry about, let's say, over the next couple of years, but the work towards that needs to be done now, and not very sure how well prepared both countries are on that front. AI is something, as a defense and security practitioner, my view is that needs a great deal of regulation. And there needs to be something, a global treaty on this, akin to, let's say, the Artemis Accord, something like that. AI it can be useful, it could be, but there has to be a limit, and it needs to be regulated. So, so one has to be a little careful, cautious about that subject, especially in the defense and security space. Of course, it's got extremely useful applications in civilian life. But then AI also holds a great deal of promise. So if one can separate out and stay with the good part of the AI, I think one is in the clear. There's so many applications that we ourselves are now developing in L&T, which are AI-based. We ran a smart cities program in India, so 28 smart cities were picked up. The base is it's an AI-based platform. So now that itself gives, any startup can do well to emulate a model like that and use that for either, all kinds of applications, not only in the defense and security domains, but also in the civil sector. So that's clearly, but then as I said again, in the defense area, I think AI needs some regulation and some thought there, and that needs to really be the like-minded democracies need to take a step forward in that direction.
Okay, we're going to shift gears slightly. You obviously have an auto industry background, and you have both talked briefly about microelectronics and the semiconductor industry. And so we, as you're likely well aware, the CHIPS Act was signed, and there's now $50 billion being poured into the semiconductor industry and trying to onshore that in the US. Which brings up that there are these now microelectronics commons hubs. And with me being a Surface Warfare Center crane person, I'm very tied into that community and some of the leaders there. But USC specifically is one of the hubs for the microelectronics commons. And so I'm interested to hear from both of you. I guess we will start with Nick on this one since he's embedded in USC, but just to kind of hear, how do you feel that US and India can collaborate on this microelectronics commons initiative specifically?
Yeah, so the CHIP Act, I think you mentioned, and I had an opportunity to provide some insight on to when President Biden decided to do 365-day review of the supply chain design. I think one of the big 5 verticals we focus on is semiconductor being the first one. I think these collaborations, when we think about semiconductor. So you start to think about how do we actually replace the current capacity that we need and onshore or near shore as much as we can, or at least put the network design as such that it stays within the allies and the like-minded trading partners. So that's a phase one. The phase two, which is the next generation, three-dimensional chips and chips that are capable of providing some of the advanced capacity and capabilities that what we have seen primarily dominated by two semiconductor manufacturer that's led close to $1 trillion economy in less than a year in an AI space. What is the infrastructure needed? And when you talk about the onshoring semiconductor, you're talking about not only the equipment manufacturers and the next generation, but the electricity, water, human capital, and subsequent infrastructure that you need, both the hard and soft infrastructure you need. So I think we certainly have taken this journey, at least in the US, to build that hard infrastructure. And that number appears to be now close to $75 billion on it. And I think it's continuing to expand the scope. I think India equally is working on it. I mean, today, this morning, as before I got onto the call, which is very early, 1 in 7 iPhone 15 is produced by India. 2.5 years ago, this was not even a possibility, 3 years ago. So if you see the shift of how the semiconductor industry, and I think US-India collaboration is going to play into this, is truly a huge opportunity. Specific to USC, I mean, we are school of schools. We have 22 schools between engineering, business, policies. We have a robust faculty and center of excellence that really becomes a gateway for industry and government and academicians to work together in a very collaborative way. And I'm very proud and privileged to be in the position where I run the institute, and my work with the governments and policymakers as well as industry leaders to sort of not only look at the blueprint, but also help execute some of those ideas into fruition. I think it's a great position for us to contribute in the future of global supply chain network design.
And Vikas, you're definitely no stranger to the impacts and the pain that is felt with your experience from the auto industry and now supporting defense. So do you have any thoughts on how India can better support this initiative too?
Yes, okay. So if you look at systems, whether the defense or auto or industrial systems, there are a couple of things. So when you change the fab, I do not know if how many people know this, but when you change the fab, the chip actually needs to be redesigned. So that's one. So the chip is actually married to the fab, and so the design, the fab, the product design, they go hand in hand. So India is setting up a few large fabs here. There are also a few companies, including us, who getting into product design as well of semiconductors. So in addition to, so ours would be a fabless model, and others are investing in a fab at the moment. So I actually see a very bright future for a collaboration between the US and India in the semiconductor space. Because the way I look at it, there is a need to redesign products themselves. So to follow a path of software-defined X, so software-defined communication, so, SDR, software-defined radio. You will have software-defined vehicles as more and more cars go electric. So it will be you also have to look at it from a different dimension. The world is gradually weaning off oil. So you would have more and more alternate forms of propulsion, which brings in the need. So you either get into a situation where you just expand the number of semiconductors in use in a vehicle or in a defense platform, or be sensible about it and start redesigning parts of it to actually become software-defined systems. So that's one aspect. Having said that, there will still be a need for a system of systems which is semiconductor-based. And that's an area where I think the US and India and institutes such as the USC need to very closely collaborate with at least with the large industry in India who are investing in this space. Now, and this is something which would be, I would say, only between the democracies. So I haven't heard of other countries who have been thinking along these lines. So that's an area that the way we look at it, there will be a gradual move towards SE, software-defined vehicles or concepts. And of course, the semiconductors themselves are going to become increasingly more complex. Having said that, the point that Dr. Vyas had mentioned earlier, I think is extremely important, and that is the access, the extraction of the minerals needed for the sector to grow. So one has to also keep that at the back of the mind, and then assess what ought to be the strategy going forward. So the demand is only going to grow. Right?
Okay, I'm going to shift quickly to one of the questions that is in the Q&A section. And it says, is INSEN and DIU involved in supporting early stage startups? How about the eVTOL and UAM sectors? And so I'll take that one really quickly. So you can definitely find information about what INSEN is doing in a variety of tech verticals on diu.mil and insen.mil, as well as the LinkedIn pages. We are putting out materials on active challenges and the variety of programming that we support in the startup and venture portfolio. I'm not privy or familiar if there are any eVTOL specifically at the moment. Somebody else may type that into the chat, but you can definitely see some of the tech verticals and the focus areas of DIU and INSEN online. Just for a little bit of awareness, INSEN, INSIC, and DIU sort of service different technical readiness levels. And so you'll see a variety maybe on the same topic, but looking for different levels of solutions. So I would direct you there first and foremost. And then one of the questions in the webinar chat that we will probably wrap up this session with is, it says a question to both, but maybe if one of you feels like you have the insight into this, I'll let you go first and then we will wrap up our hour session. So broad question to both. What are studied ways, existing roadmaps followed by any country, in which a local supply chain can rapidly be built in India? What would be the policy changes required to address this issue?
So 2016, Prime Minister Modi under Minister Gadkari had asked me to speak at the supply chain summit in Delhi. And this leads us back to about 8 years ago. And the vision at that point was, in order for any country, I mean, you think about most advanced economy, the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure is obviously needs to be a robust, right? I mean, how do you connect the waterways, the roadways, the inland depots, and building the infrastructure where you remove as much of a friction you can out of your system? This is India-wide, right? then that has to overlay with the policies in which you try to make sure the bureaucracies is streamlined and is pro-business, business friendly in terms of not having the resource consumption more than it needs to be. And then the third part of that is expanding the digital infrastructure to support the country's supply chain network, right? So you have physical infrastructure with streamlined bureaucracy. On top is a digital infrastructure. And then the last but not the least, I actually work with the advisory capacity with the skill ministries to say, you need the license. If India were to become an advanced economy, you can no longer have somebody just off the street come and start to grab a screwdriver and start to fix the equipment. I mean, you have to have certified electricians, level 1, 2, 3, all the way up to whatever the level that you decide to every technical job, not just an engineer, but intermediary job has to be skilled, trained, retrained. So when you see that demand of that landscape of human capital need in India, it's in millions. I mean, it's a decade or longer efforts for local universities, local companies to work together, and foreign collaborative universities, which we're very happy the USC will be part of that. But this is what I consider are some of the fundamental work that needs to be done. And I think Indian government, if I were to reflect from that time when I was in Delhi to now, I think has done some incredible work to achieve that. And I think we're, in my view, being there in January for about 3.5 weeks, I feel India still has almost a decade more solidifying to build on each of those layers that I just established. But positive directions, tremendous accomplishment. Being a democracy, it's not like an autocracy where you can just demand something from the central and everything happens. You still have to work within the framework of democracy to make all these things happen. Within that limitations and constraint, I think India has executed, at least in my view, an incredible path over last several years, and hope that it continues on to the decade, because I think if all of those factors were to play in, I think there's a tremendous optimism. And obviously from the US business leaders that I speak with, they're very bullish in the future and in a collaboration rather. Vikash?
Dr. Vyas has summed it up extremely well, and compliments to you, Dr. Vyas. Yes, I mean, you're right. And to the gentleman who asked the question, I can only point at a recent example. The space sector, the Indian space sector was opened up to private industry only a couple of years ago. And look at how it's developed. So it's not as if we're looking at some established playbook. There is an Indian entrepreneurial spirit. The government is fully supportive, and the larger organizations know that for their own survival, will have to leverage the startups who are far more nimble, as opposed to the bureaucracies that fit in over time in the larger companies. And so therefore, so there are these. The only thing is that my sense in all this is that we have unleashed animal spirit. There is now great expectation, and as Indians, we tend to be extremely enterprising. So people are now looking at expanding in other parts of the world as well. And they're looking for collaborations, they're looking for partnerships, they're looking for business deals in India and abroad. And that frankly should also be music to the ears of American startups, because they would get a low cost partner here in India and become far more competitive. And so I see this as an extremely positive thing. One can also go back 35 years, and I was in the midst of it then when the auto revolution came about in India. And at that time, there were just a handful of us who could read a Japanese drawing. So, and from there, India is one of the leading exporters of not just automobiles, but also auto components. So, I mean, you have it. And so there are both examples, recent and 35, 36, or 40 years ago. There are both examples. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Well, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us. I know I'm on the Pacific coast right now as well, so it's very early here and it's getting late into the evening for others. So thank you for taking the time out of your day. I also wanted to just direct the participants that if they have additional questions or would like to get in touch with you, we have your information in a post on the INSEN LinkedIn post that's highlighting and featuring this session specifically. They can reach out in that way. And then just to be keeping your eyes on the INSEN and DIU websites and LinkedIn channels for future sessions, as those will be forthcoming and you can find information there. Feel free to send questions, create conversation on those posts as well, and we will try to engage as soon as we are able. So thank you so much again, and we hope to see you soon.